Welcome back to Problem Solving and Programming Techniques. We're going to be finishing up the second half of Chapter 2. In this part, we're going to talk about while loops, for loop, ranges, the break statement, the continue statement, and then how we can use while loops for input validation. We're going to touch on modules real quick, and we're going to mention the exit function. So while loops are one of the two loops that we get in Python. And they help us be able to reuse code, repeat things. So, for example, if I wanted to count to 1,000,000, I don't want to do that one line at a time. Instead, I can create a loop that does that. So, as you can see with the syntax, it says while condition and then a code block. So, just like we had an if statement and a condition, and then what was tabbed over inside that code block was controlled by it, we have the same situation here. So as long as the condition is true, we keep going. And we can see that we have an example of I have 0 stored in a variable x. That's what my single equal sign does. So now I ask while x, which right now is 0, is less than 5, which 0 is less than 5, then I will print out x. And then I have x plus equal 1. So we call that an augmented assignment operator. It's just a fancy word for that plus equal 1. I'm going to add 1 to x and then save it as x. So right now I have 0 plus 1. Well, that gives me 1. So then I go back into the top and I do my comparison. 1 is still less than 5. So now I will print x, which is 1, and then add 1 to it and get 2. So we'll step into code real quick. We've typed our sample code into Visual Studio so that we can see this actually run. You can hit the play button up here in order to make it play. I'm using the Python command down here, and then I'm passing in my .py file. And you can see it prints out 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. We started at 0. We added 1 each time. And we stopped when x was less than 5. So when x equaled 5, this was no longer true. If I come in and add an equal sign and then save it, come down here and hit the up key to get my previous PowerShell command, and I can rerun it. And you can see now I get 5. We could come in and make other adjustments to this as well. Let's say I wanted to step up by 2, and I wanted to start at 4, and I want it to be less than or equal to 25. And then I'm going to save it again. So Control S, save. Hit the up key, enter. And you can see it started at 4. Now we got 6, 8, 10, 12. It counts all the way up. And then it stops at 24 because I'm adding 2. So 24 plus 2 is 26. And that's not less than or equal to 25. So this is a basic gist of how the while loop works. If I did not have this part, let's go ahead and take that off for a minute, because this is an important factor with the while loop. So I'm going to come in here, going to type clear so that we can get a clean line here. And then we'll rerun my command, rerun my Python file. I have to save it first. There we go. So now I will rerun it, and you can see it keeps saying 4. So I have to hit Control C in order to terminate this, because I got what we call an infinite loop. There's no way for x to ever equal or be greater than 25, because it will always be 4. So if there's no way to change the variable that we're comparing against, then we have an infinite loop and there's no way out of it. So this would just ran until I hit stop like I did. As you can see, the other loop that Python gives us is the for loop. So this one is used to iterate over sequences. So we have lists, tuples, strings, ranges. These are all things that we'll talk about later on. We've kind of mentioned the strings. But when we know exactly how many times we're going to need to do something, that's when the for loop really shines. The while loop, we used it in a way that is very similar to the for loop, but we'll see later on how the while loop is looking for input or looking for variations. So we don't know exactly how many times we're going to do something. So the for loop is really the better loop for what we were just doing with the numbers and the counting. So as you can see, it's very similar to the while loop. We have for this time, but we have a variable. And then we have the keyword in, and then a sequence. And then a block of code that is controlled by that, just like an if statement or a while statement would have or a while loop would have a block of code that is controlled by that statement. So if we look at our example, we have for char, which is character, for character in Python, we're going to print the character. Now notice I don't have anything adding in or subtracting. I'm not making any changes. It's just going to go through the string of Python and it's going to print each letter. So let's take a look at this one. Here we have our for loop example in Visual Studio Code. You can see we still have the for keyword. And then we have char, which is our variable. By the way, you can hover over this stuff and it will give you some information. We have the keyword in, and then we have our string Python. And then tabbed underneath in the block of code that's controlled by my for loop, I have a print function, and I'm going to print out my variable that is created. So each time this goes through, it's going to take a character from the word Python and put it into my variable named char. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And you can see it put a capital P, and then it went to a new line, put a Y, new line, T, and it stepped all the way through. Now I can have multiple lines of stuff under here. So I can print, but it's simple, but it's going to demonstrate what we're doing. So come down here, hit the up key, and you can see for each letter, it prints the letter and then hello all the way through. So you can see that it is stepping through this for loop. Now that we have our loops, we can start looking at tools that we have to be more effective with these loops. And the first one that we have is the range function. So this function generates just a sequence of numbers. So I told you earlier when we were looking at the for loop that what we had done with the while loop was really not a good fit for the while loop. It just demonstrated how the comparisons and the checking for true work and how we needed to have a way to change that comparison variable. In reality, the best way to count is going to be using a range function inside a for loop like we see here. I copied the sample code for the range function over to Visual Studio Code, and I still have it inside our for loop. So you can see I have for a variable I in range, and then print I. Now, when I drew up these slides, I put I in here, but in reality, I doesn't really explain what's there. So I'm going to change this to be none. Because now this explains I'm going to be getting a number. And it helps me understand what's going on with my code. So now I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I'm going to run it. And you can see it prints 1, and then it adds 2 to it. So what the range function does, this is what I start at. so 1. And then I add 2, so that's going to give me 3. And then add 2 to that is 5. Add 2 is 7. Add 2 is 9. Well, I stop at 10. So right here, you can see if I add 2 to 9, I would get 11. So that's why it stopped. I can also change this count by 1. And I will save it. Going to come down here and clear the up key twice so I can rerun my command. And you can see now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It doesn't print 10 because this stop, this is less than 10. If I were counting in a negative direction, then it would be greater than. So basically when it equals whatever the stop character is, it does not continue on. Now, the range function is kind of interesting because if I hover over it, I can see I have a start, a stop, and a step. But it also has other things it can do. So I just deleted my step. And I can save it. So I clear it. And then I will rerun it. And you can see it still steps by 1. That's because by default, it's going to step by 1. You can see it's not set. Same thing right now, it starts at 1 and it goes to 10. So I take the 1 off the front. Now the only thing that I have is the stop. So by default, it's going to start at 0 and then it's going to add 1 each time. So you can see all this information in Visual Studio Code, which is part of the reason why we use it, because it's going to show us different ways that we can use our stuff, and it's going to tell us what kind of data types we're working with and things like that. So you can see this is an integer and it's a variable named null. This is very useful whenever you're going through and working on code, especially whenever you're working on code that you didn't write, that maybe you inherited from a coworker, and you have to figure some things out. So I've saved this. So now we have range, stop at 10. So I'll clear this again. And then rerun my command. And you can see now it starts at 0 and it goes all the way to 9. Sometimes when we're working with a loop, we have situations that we want to just get out of the loop immediately and continue on with whatever we were doing or end our program. So if we need to get out of a loop, the easiest way to stop that loop is to use the break statement. As you can see, I've added our break statement into the for loop and the range function that we were using on the previous code example. So I have if my number equals 5, then I'm going to break. Now, each time I go through this loop, you can see I'm also printing my number because all this stuff lines up on the same tab. And notice my break is controlled by this if statement. So when I run this, now it says 1, 2, 3, 4, and as soon as it hits 5, it doesn't print 5. It just breaks out of that loop and my program ends. Sometimes I don't want to end my loop. I just want to skip over something. So that's where continue comes in. So this time it's going to skip the print for 5 and it will continue on for the rest of the range. Well, here's our code that we were working with just a minute ago to show our break statement. So I'm going to change break to continue. Notice I can hit tab and Visual Studio already has it there, so I don't have to type the rest of it. I'm going to hit save. Remember, we're looping over our range. We start at 0, we work all the way to 10. Last time when we hit 5, it broke out of our loop using the break statement. So this time we're going to see what it does. So I'll clear. You can see now we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. We skip 5, and then we have 6, 7, 8, 9. So what happened here, when my number, num, was equal to 5, this if statement was true. So we hit continue. Well, when we continue, we stop everything for this iteration. So we did not keep going. As soon as we hit continue, we go back up here, and num becomes the next number in the range, which is 6. Then 6 comes through. Well, it's not equal to 5, so we don't hit this continue again. So continue only stops execution inside of the loop and then starts the next iteration. Break stops the entire loop. So that's the big difference. We spent a good bit of time playing with the for loop. And when we first talked about the while loop, I said that it wasn't really for iterating over stuff. That it had other purposes. And input validation is a very good use for a while loop, because this one, it allows the user to decide when the loop is over. So validation means that we're going to check the data that we're getting from a user, or if we're going through a file and pulling data in, we want to make sure that whatever we're saving is worth saving. Because if you save bad data, then that means you have to take time fixing it later on. So we want to go ahead and avoid ever getting bad data into our system by checking it ahead of time. And we're going to make the user fix that data so that we don't have to do it. Here's our validation sample code. So the purpose of this is I'm asking for an age, but I have to convert this age that I get from the user from a string, which you can see I get an input of a string. That's what that arrow with str at the bottom means right there. So I'm getting a string. I'm going to put it in a variable. Now I'm going to check and see, is this a number? Is it a digit? And you can see this is going to give me a bool, so true or false. So if it's true, then that means it's a digit. I'm going to convert that to an integer. And if it's not true, then I'm going to say, oh, I got a capital M there. I'm going to say that's an invalid input. Please enter a number. And I have while true in here. It's not considered good practice to say while true, because there's nothing that changes in here. But the only reason that this works is because I have a break statement here. As we talked about, break is going to end this loop. So as soon as they give me a good number, then we will end the loop. Until then, we're just going to keep asking them for numbers. So let's save this. And we will run our code using the Python command. And it says enter your age. So I'm going to put 3. It says invalid input. Please enter a number. So now I can hit 3 and it will exit out. Let's pretend for a moment that we're not validating. So I'm going to copy this. So Control C, then make space for it, Control V. Now I have to fix my tab issues. And then I'm going to comment the rest of this out. So I could go through and put pound signs in front of everything if I wanted to. So I could do something like this, but we also have 3 single quotes, or 3 quotes, single or double. So that just commented out all that code. So we have an infinite loop. I'm not worried about it because we're not going to go through this loop multiple times with what I'm doing. So I'm going to save it. So Control S. I got to be up here. Control S. Then I will run my code again, and you can see it says enter your age. Now, if I put 3 in here, yes, it's going to keep asking. But if I don't put a number in there, you can see I'm getting an error message. That's because I'm trying to turn something into an integer that is not a number. So that's why we need our validation for this one, because I'm trying to prevent that error message. I'm going to come in here, delete that, delete that. Now, this open space here, it does not change the way that the code works. It just helps me be able to see that I'm collecting information up here. So I'm asking the user to enter their age and I'm saving it. And then I have my validation down here. So I could even add a comment that says, to validate the number was entered. And come down here and clear. And we can see that it still works. So this prevents errors in my code because I'm requiring that I get good information. So that's called validation, and validation is your friend. Everything that we've talked about in Python so far has been included. So when we were working with the if statements and booleans and loops, and we had the print function, the input function, all these things came with Python. But sometimes we need to do things that aren't included in the basic utilities that we get with the Python programming language. So we need ways to be able to bring in other libraries, and these are called modules. So we can write our own code, our own modules, and that's not going to be covered in this class, but it's easy to do once you learn how to write functions, which we'll cover later on. But you can write your own modules when the day comes. But also there's a lot of stuff that has been written by other people and made available. So you can see in our example, we have import math and then print math, SQRT. Well, that's square root of 16. I don't have to calculate square root. Fortunately, somebody wrote a math module and there's a function in there that calculates square root. So I don't have to write it. I just have to go find the module. So in this case, I know that it's math, so I will import that. Moved our sample code over into Visual Studio. So you can see I'm importing the math module. You can see it's a module. And then I'm going to call the square root function on math. So when I import a module, I have to use the name of the module and then dot in order to get the functions that I'm using. We call this dot notation. And then whatever I get, I'm going to print. So we can see here that it returns a float. So when I run this, I would expect to get a float. So I'm going to have a decimal. In this case, square root of 16 is 4. So I would expect 4.0. And there it is. We have 4.0. There are other things that we can use. So instead of math, I have random. So I don't have math here anymore, but I can do random dot. This gives me a random int. So this returns a random integer in the range of A to B. So let's say I want to roll a six-sided dice or a six-sided die. The options are 1 through 6. I saved it. Got 1, 6, 5, 4. There's another 4. So there's all kinds of different things in there. You can check on Google or whatever search engine you want. and you can look up Python modules, and you're going to find all kinds of stuff out there. So a lot of times we don't have to worry about writing stuff because we'll be able to find it already written by somebody because Python's been around for a while. The last thing that we're going to talk about in Chapter 2 is the exit function. This is a function that comes with Python. If you remember, whenever we were working with getting the version of Python through command line, I told you to type exit and then put parentheses behind it. That's because we were calling this function to exit out of the interactive Python shell. So this just stops your program wherever you're at and exits out of the program. Here's our code that we were just working with. So now I want it to exit out whenever I finally get a 6. So I need to make some adjustments. So I'm going to put it inside the while loop, so just keep going. And then I need to make my random randint be a variable. So I'm going to put num equals. I'm going to retype everything. And I'll put if num. Now I'm going to check and see is it equal to 6. And if so, I'm going to exit out of the whole program. And I don't need an else because I'm just going to continue on. So I'm going to print num. Then I'm going to get some space up here. So let's save it. So you can see it got 3, 3, 2, 2, 1, 4, 5, 5, 4. So you can see I didn't print there. Let's move this up so that we can see our 6. So Control X cut. Control V will paste. So now let's save it. I'm going to rerun it. So apparently I got 6 the first time. Got 316. So you can see it always ends with the 6, and we're exiting out of the Python program. In this video, we talked about Python loops. We have the while loop and the for loop. And then we talked about ranges. So this is a way to get a range of numbers to work with. We talked about the break statement that exits out of the loop immediately. We talked about continue, which allows us to skip certain items inside of our loop, but we keep going through the loop. We talked about input validation so that we can keep users from putting bad data into our program. And then we talked about how to import modules so we can get code that is provided by other Python programmers. And then we talked about the exit function.